Hi there, Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take to kick off your week. It is, of course, all Russia right now because the Americans put forward a 28-point plan that they said was ready to go, a peace deal between the Russians and Ukrainians. It was mostly drafted by the Russians, as was very evident by the sorts of things that were in it. Steve Witkoff engaged back and forth with the Kremlin, particularly Kirill Dmitriev was a senior advisor to Putin, who spent some time at Witkoff's house in Miami, and showed it to Trump. And Trump is like, "Great, let's do it." This was included a number of things that are complete non-starters from the Ukrainian perspective, like Ukraine giving up a lot more land that the Russians haven't actually taken militarily. Ukraine being willing to reduce the scale of their military, the troops under arms, from the numbers that they presently have, as well as willingness to accept complete amnesty for war crimes for all of the Russians. None of those things are plausible with a Ukrainian leader staying in office. With any government that would accept it would be illegitimate in the eyes of the strong majority of Ukrainians, even though most Ukrainians now do want a ceasefire. They don't want the war to continue, but they want a ceasefire under Ukrainian terms as well, not under Russian written terms. So this wasn't going anywhere, but it was interesting that Trump, who has been trying to end this war ineffectively for all of this year pretty much, was grabbing at it. And Trump has made very clear over and over he wants the war over. And it's not just when he's asked questions about it proactively. This is obviously something that bothers him. He tends to blame the Ukrainians more than the Russians, even though the Ukrainians were the ones that were invaded, not the ones doing the invading. But because they're a smaller and weaker power, and therefore Trump has more influence over them, he tends to be more willing to say, you guys are not grateful. You don't, you're not accepting a peace that we need to have. You shouldn't continue to fight. But he does blame the Russians as well. And we saw that just 2 months ago when Trump said publicly that he thought that the Ukrainians could win, especially with the support that they're getting from Europe. If they could get all of their land back from the Russians, which I certainly don't believe. I doubt that Trump believes it, and it felt like BS at the time. But it's not necessarily any more BS than the plan that Trump put forward as if it was his own over this past week. That's not feasible either. So the Europeans once again got involved. And Marco Rubio, Secretary of State as well, who hadn't been on point with the initial 28-point plan, and indeed was on the phone with a number of U.S. senators, Democrat and Republican, who were attending the Halifax forum, which is sort of like a smaller version of Munich Security Conference going on this weekend. And that's where you got people saying that, according to Rubio, this plan was all Russian talking points, which of course then he backed off of and said later publicly, no, this is something that Trump is starting. It's not a fully baked plan. It's a living document. But certainly wasn't trying to stick with the idea that this was a Russian plan, but rather that it's one that it involves the Ukrainians. Everyone needs to talk. It's evolution towards peace, basically just trying to get the comms a little bit more aligned than they had been. But it was very clear that there were lots of things that the Europeans wouldn't accept, that the Ukrainians wouldn't accept, and that became more aligned over this weekend in Geneva, where the Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans were all engaging in diplomacy. Everyone now is publicly saying how much they appreciate the American plan. They appreciate the effort because they don't want to offend Trump, because they want the Americans to stay involved. But that doesn't mean that they're going to accept any of it. Alex Stubb, who is the president of Finland and has been both pretty close to Trump on all of this, but also quite hawkish in terms of what the final outcome needs to look like from the European and Ukrainian perspective, has said very clearly, yes, thank you very much for the Americans. There's going to be a two-track approach, and all the things that are within the European and NATO competency will be handled on those tracks, not unilaterally by the Americans. And he's in a much stronger position to say that because as of today, the Europeans are providing almost all of the funding for the ongoing war in Ukraine and reconstruction. The Americans are not. They're selling weapons and they are providing intelligence, but the money is coming from the Europeans, the European taxpayers. The Americans are not. And indeed, Trump talks about this a lot with a lot of his supporters, saying that actually the Americans are now making money on the war in Ukraine because of all the weapons that are being sold by the U.S. military industrial complex. And so as of today, we are mostly back to where we were a week ago. And that is that the war is not close to over, that the ceasefire is not real, that there are no negotiations imminent between the Russians and the Ukrainians directly. And it's the Russians that aren't willing to stop, and they're not willing to stop because they see that the United States is willing to mostly support a Russian plan. They see that a lot of the Europeans are divided. You've got countries like Hungary and Slovakia that are very, very skeptical of continuing to provide support. You've got Belgium, which is saying we don't want to seize the Russian assets that are presently frozen. You've got the Spaniards, the Italians that are providing very little direct funding, while the Germans, the French, the Nordics, the Balts are providing a lot more. And the Russians are able to continue to fight and they think take more territory. So I still believe that a lot of this is going to get resolved, unfortunately, on the battlefield, that there isn't yet enough willingness to compromise, certainly given the comparative lack of alignment between the Americans and Russians, mostly on one side, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians, mostly on the other. The Russians are going to try their damnedest to continue to change the facts on the ground to their advantage to get a better outcome. And let's face it, so far they've been right. The willingness to negotiate a Russian set of plans, it's a lot more aligned with them today than it was 6 months ago, 12 months ago, 2 years ago. And if the Russians continue to win, that is going to continue to be likely to be the case. And this certainly needs to inform the Europeans and the Ukrainians to a degree, but not to the point that the President Trump is willing to on the Dmitriev/Kremlin plan. And even if you had more willingness to get to yes on the part of the Ukrainians and the Europeans, I still don't think we're close to anything that the Russians would accept. That seems like the safe bet right now, even though it's a very dangerous bet for both the Ukrainians and the Russians on the ground. That's it for me. I'll talk to you all real soon.